Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so we're in the conclusion. Like I said, I think I said this in the last video, the conclusion is quite nice. It's 40 pages and a really solid summary and outline of everything that he's talked about in the book. I did say I wanted to get through this in 2 videos. It seems that's a little bit ambitious. My revised estimate for the conclusion is 3 videos. And with that said, the first video today, I've broken it down into 3 parts: representation, grounding, and groundlessness, and simulacra. So let's have a look at the first part, representation. So representation is basically the model that philosophy has used to try to understand or explain reality. It's made up of 4 parts. Deleuze calls these the 4 roots of the principle of reason. And those are identity in the concept, opposition in the predicate, analogy in judgment, and resemblance in perception. And we'll look at each of those a couple more times in this section, just to flesh out what they each mean. The main idea then for Deleuze regarding representation is that philosophy has tried to eliminate or subordinate difference through this model of representation. We looked at 3 philosophers in particular in the book who exemplify this model, who kind of stand out in the history of philosophy as trying to understand reality by eliminating difference through this model of representation. The first was Leibniz, and the first 2 actually are Leibniz and Hegel, and these are both to do with the finite and the infinite. So with Leibniz, his goal is to approach reality through the infinitely small, and going through the infinitely small to capture or eliminate the smallest difference. So trying to approach the world from the position of analysis, analyzing things into their component parts right down to this infinitesimal level. Deleuze calls this procedure vice diction, and he describes it as constructing the essence from the inessential, trying to understand what a thing is through breaking it down into these infinitesimal parts, or conquering the finite by an infinite analysis, conquering the finite thing, whatever it might be, by an analysis that delves down into the infinite, just keeps going down until you get to these infinitesimal points. And the opposite with that was Hegel, who uses the infinitely large to capture or again eliminate the largest difference. Deleuze calls this procedure contradiction, and the idea with this is an exact parallel to, or contradistinction to, Leibniz. Hegel is inscribing the inessential in the essence. And so with Hegel, it's the exact opposite to what we saw with Leibniz. We're starting with the essence, the totality. Well, that's kind of the encapsulating idea, this absolute mind, or some kind of universal consciousness, if you like. And then understanding the parts through a relation that they have, and not just understanding them, but eliminating the differences between parts through a synthesis. And that's the other part here. Hegel is conquering the infinite by a finite synthesis. So that was Leibniz and Hegel. We also looked at Plato in a bit of detail. And for Deleuze, the elimination of difference started with Plato. And as a kind of summary of Deleuze's take on this, Plato's picture starts with, or has three parts, if you like: a model, which is the ideas or the forms; then a copy, which participates in the model in some way; and then the phantasm or the simulacra, which are the copies, the fake copies, if you like. They're the things that fail the test of the copy and the requirements of the model. So they don't manage to qualify as copies, genuine copies. And the goal for Plato, according to Deleuze, is to eliminate the simulacra. That is to say, eliminate those things that are genuinely different, that don't bear this resemblance to the model. So there are four parts to this, which match the four roots of the principle of reason. The first is identity. Identity appears in the model itself, which is the ideas or the forms, and these are the essence of the same. So they are what they are. There's no trace of difference in them. They are 100% identical with themselves, these the forms. Resemblance appears through the way that the copies are similar to the model. Analogy occurs in the way, and this is a little bit tricky, but the way that the copy has, Deleuze says, an internal relation to being and the true, which is analogous to that of the model. And so what I think he's getting at here is that as a thing, the copy is the same kind of thing that the model is. So they have this intrinsic sameness to them. And that's the analogy. That's what analogy means here. And this sameness, being the same kind of thing, means to be a thing that is posited as determinable according to categories, those categories of being that were so famous, made famous by Aristotle and Kant in particular. But according to those fixed categories, that's what determines the thing. And it's the same with the model. And so there's an analogy between the two. And the last step I've got is, it's not really a step, but it's the last aspect of Plato's philosophy here, is opposition. And so given two opposed predicates, the copy is constructed only from the one which agrees with the model. So it's eliminating, so it's constructing, the copy is being constructed from that which matches, which resembles the model, but it's being constructed by rejecting that which doesn't. So again, rejecting, eliminating difference. And that's kind of the thread that runs through all of these four roots of the principle of reason and representation itself. It's all about eliminating difference. So another part to this is the way that representation relates or features in thought, the way we think about thought. And again, we'll see that it features here, representation comes in as an elimination of difference. So let me give you a quote. Representation is a site of transcendental illusion. In effect, thought is covered over by an image made up of postulates which distort both its operation and its genesis. These postulates culminate in the position of an identical thinking subject which functions as a principle of identity for concepts in general. So representation leads to a distortion of what thought is, both how thought operates, but also where thought comes from, how thought arises. And it does this because it provides an identical thinking, i.e. Cartesian subject. That is, a subject that is what it is, that is identical to itself, has no trace of difference, and which stands over and above the world that it surveys outside itself like a spectator. And the four roots of representation appear here again. So we have identity and the concept, difference. Difference is represented through the identity of the concept and the thinking subject. So when I say difference is represented, basically what I mean is difference is eliminated. Representation eliminates difference by positing the identity of the concept and the identity of the thinking subject. The concept is what it is. The thinking subject is also what it is. There's no difference here. This we called common sense, if you remember. Resemblance in the perception. Difference here is cancelled in the quality which covers it, which covers the difference, and inequality is equalized within the extension in which it is distributed. So there are two ways that difference is eliminated when thinking about resemblance. First, in the quality. The quality covers over any differences in things, and any inequality is equalized within the extension. And those, if you remember, quality and extension, those are the two ways that ideas are actualized. And we'll be coming to that a little bit later as well. But that Deleuze called good sense. So we've got common sense and good sense, and those are two of the key postulates regarding the image of thought as understood as representation, or thought understood through this model of representation. Then we have opposition. Opposition features in the predicate, and this always arises through some kind of limitation or negation, which subordinates, which eliminates the difference. So something like, so a predicate, in order to predicate whatever it is, whatever the subject is, it is distinguishing itself from other things which are not that predicate, which don't have that predicate in relation to the subject. So its whole modus operandi, if you like, is negation. It's opposition to things which it is not, or which it doesn't have. But for Deleuze, as we saw in that section on the image of thought, rather than opposition, for Deleuze it's problems and solutions. Problems as differential positings, and solutions as incarnations or actualizations. And the other important thing he mentions here is that problems and solutions are unconscious. So that we're dealing at a level prior to deliberate, active, conscious intention. This is the level from which those things arise, from which thinking begins. And so that's how Deleuze is getting to the source, the origin of thinking, of thought. In order to get to the origin of thought, you've got to go beneath thought. And the only thing that can be beneath thought, or whatever it is that's beneath thought, must be unthinking, unconscious. So representation, the very way that it works as dealing with a thinking subject, has already arrived too late. It already misses the mark. Because if problems and solutions are unconscious, and this is the grounding, the origin of thought, representation as thought, as thinking, a thinking subject is too late already. And the last of those four roots is analogy in judgment. And again, as we said before, each concept has an internal relation to being. And so each concept is the thing that it is what it is, through these categories, these fixed categories of being. So it's all, again, very organized and fixed and clear. Everything fits into place, and there's no difference. There's nothing that is genuinely chaotic in this picture. And that's a problem for Deleuze. So that's representation and thought. And he also talks about here representation and repetition, and the way that this model of representation distorts true repetition. And when it does this, repetition becomes, he says, material and bare. And so again, we can work through those four aspects of repetition, beginning with identity, where repetition is seen to take place outside the concept. So it doesn't affect anything intrinsic. It doesn't affect anything that's meaningful in this picture. It's external to the concept. So you have the concept which remains the same, while repetition occurs when things are merely distinguished from it in space and time. So the concept is the same, but you have these different instantiations, if you like, of that concept which resemble it, but the identity in the concept stays the same. And it's basically a good way to think about that is just that Platonic model, right? The forms are those unchanging, identical concepts. Then resemblance, the second aspect of representation. Representation forces repetition to appear as the similar. So whenever anything repeats, it's repeating because it's similar to that original. Opposition is the third aspect. And here Deleuze says repetition can only be negatively determined. So things repeat by virtue of what they are not and what they do not have. So you've got there's kind of a dual, or a dual pairing there, if you like, between opposition and resemblance. Whatever is being repeated resembles the original, but it also defines itself in opposition to other things, other repetitions, other copies, other instances. And he gives some good examples of this, I think. He says, with regard to language repeats because the words that it is composed of are not real, because there's no definition other than nominal. So they have no intrinsic essence to themselves, these words. They're just nominal. They just name things. They have no core. So language can repeat because it's just material. It's bare. There's no depth. Nothing is being grasped in depth here. Nature repeats because matter has no interiority. It is, in that nice phrase that, as far as I'm aware, Merleau-Ponty made this a thing, partes extra partes. It's just separate parts, all isolated, independent, external to each other. There's no interiority to matter. Because of that, it can repeat. It repeats. And the same with the unconscious. The unconscious repeats because the ego represses, because the id has no memory, no recognition, and no consciousness of itself. Again, there's no depth here. So without that, without getting into the depth, you just get this superficial repetition. And that's how representation depicts repetition, as the superficial copying. But there's no understanding of depth, and everything's presented only as superficial, without any deeper grasp of the interiority of these things, or the essence that goes into them. And finally, the last aspect of representation is analogy. And here, every variant of the concept is not necessarily a new instance of the same concept, but it can be the same concept instantiated in different situations. So here we've got the same thing. And this is the analogy coming in between the original and the copy. It's the same thing, just being transplanted to a different situation, a different context. So there's an analogy between the two. And that's representation. So we'll move on to the next part, which is grounding and groundlessness. So this was kind of an interesting section, because even though we've talked about all of these ideas, it wasn't put forward in this exact way, I don't think, in the content, the main part of the book. So this is kind of interesting to look at, and just it helps to really orient, or not orient, but it helps to kind of get a fuller picture of Deleuze's philosophy, I think. Anyway, enough rambling. So grounding. To ground is to determine. So it's to determine something, determine what is originally indeterminate, what is originally indetermined. It's to make that thing determinate, is to ground it. But to ground is always to ground in representation. So this is another part of the model of representation. And there are three senses to this, Deleuze says. The first, the ground is the same or the identical in the essence. So we have here ground as ideal essence, the grounded as the claimant, the copy, if you like, which is, or the thing which is, we're trying to determine if it is a genuine copy of the original essence. And the third part of this is that which decides the claimant's merit. And this is the quality. That which decides whether this thing is grounded, is a genuine copy, and therefore grounded in the ideal essence. So essence is the identical. The operation of grounding is resemblance. Does the claimant, the copy, resemble the essence? Each claimant is a representation, and any images which lack resemblance are rejected. And these are the simulacra. So difference here appears in qualities. There's difference in the qualities, but it's always eliminated through resemblance. There's difference in the quality between different claimants, but the one that's a genuine claimant, the one that has genuine the right to be called a copy is the one that resembles the original. So that's the first sense of grounding. The second sense of the ground is as the same or the identical in representation, the representation itself. So in the first sense, the identical was in the essence. In the second sense, the identical is in the representation, the copy, what I've been calling the copy. So the object of the claim is not difference as quality, but that which is too large or too small in the difference. In other words, Deleuze says the infinite. So this took a little bit of time to think about, because it's not initially clear what he means by saying the difference is not in the quality between different claimants, but the difference is that which is too large or too small in the difference. In other words, the infinite. What is it? Why infinite? And I think it's not so much a case of, when we're talking about resembling something, we look at the copy and then the model and try and match them and see where perhaps one doesn't fit. If the copy doesn't quite fit, does it overextend? Is there too much of the thing, or is it lacking in some way? Does it need more? And if you think about it like that, kind of in that spatial sense, it's just about impossible to understand what Deleuze means when he says the difference is in the too large or too small, the infinite, when he calls that the infinite. So I think what he's getting at here is something more like the greater levels of precision in our understanding of the copy. So when we try and determine if the copy is a genuine copy, therefore if it resembles the essence, the model, we can approach our copy by either going down to greater, picking it apart and looking at ever greater levels of precision, so digging down into the details, and it's infinite in that direction, or we can look at the greater context and keep understanding how it fits into the whole, in which case we're moving into the infinite in the opposite direction. So I think that's how Deleuze understands this when he says the difference is not in the quality itself, but in the way the copy is too large or too small. And so connecting obviously back to Leibniz and Hegel. So the grounded here is the claim of the representation to conquer the infinite, to either master the infinite downwards in the details, in the analytic sense with Leibniz, or master the infinite in the sense that the synthetic sense of Hegel, vice diction or contradiction. The operation of grounding is now to render the representation infinite, render it powerful enough maybe to grasp the infinite in one of those directions. And the ground itself operates in the heart of the representation to extend its limits to both the infinitely small and the infinitely large. And that's what I meant at the beginning here, where I said that in the second sense, the ground is the same or the identical in the representation. The ground here is not in the model, the essence, but it's in the representation itself, in the way that it conquers the infinite in both directions, the infinitely small and the infinitely large. So that's the second sense. The third sense is the ground as immemorial memory, or pure past, or again, a past which was never present. And this, Deleuze says, unites the first two, unites the ground as identical in the essence and the ground as identical in the representation. So we have those two senses, and this third sense brings them together, because here to ground is to represent the present. That is to say, to make the present arrive and pass within representation. And it does this by having this immemorial memory, this pure past, as a background on which the representation and the essence can appear. So the essence, when you have that pure past as a background, then you have that allows a present to arise for the first time. And so that's how this third sense is acting as a ground, is acting to, or is allowing us to determine a thing. And all of those three senses feature in the model of representation. So like I said, to ground is always to ground in representation. But Deleuze says, how do we explain the ambiguity that's essential to determination? Because no determination is perfect, is 100% neat and tidy and organized like this. There's always ambiguity somewhere. There has to be ambiguity. And that's the core of Deleuze's philosophy. There has to be a little bit of chaos. There has to be difference. It can't be all well-ordered and tidy. And this appears in the groundlessness, or what he also calls depth. And this is this is another way that I was saying that there is some extension, we just get a deeper understanding of some of his concepts, and depth is one of those, because here we can understand depth. I talked about it a few videos back. I think it was in chapter 6, was it? Chapter 5, with depth as being like within the idea itself, kind of an internal space or distance that we can visualize to ourselves within ideas. And this just adds another dimension to that depth as a groundlessness. Instead of our determination having a ground, our determination lacks a ground. And that, in the Deleuzian sense, is what he means by depth. So here, groundlessness or depth, ideas, Deleuze understands ideas as multiplicities, irreducible to the same or the one. So another way to say this is that they are resistant to form. They don't appear with a fixed, well-defined, well-ordered form. So elements, relations, and singularities are all determined according to the threefold principle which we looked at when we talked about ideas: determinability, reciprocal determination, and complete determination. So to ground a multiplicity in this way is to determine the indeterminate in the same way that we saw representation tried to determine the indeterminate. But the difference is not according to categories. Not according to the categories. So, and that's where the form comes in, through those categories. Categories are, and I mean, when I say categories, I mean things like the categories of being. Always, I think of Kant with those 12 categories of his that are needed to understand what a thing is, to determine what is originally indeterminate. So we're determining the indeterminate when we're grounding a multiplicity in groundlessness, but not according to the categories, because something of the ground rises to the surface without assuming any form. And it's this which makes the groundlessness groundless, because the ground itself becomes a part of our determination as of a thing being the thing that it is. And so if the ground itself comes up to become a part of it, in other words, if difference itself is maintained in some integral fashion, then there is no ground anymore, because the ground has become a part of the thing itself, a part of whatever it is that's been actualized, whatever concept or thing or perception or whatever it might be. And that's what Deleuze means when he calls this groundlessness or depth. And so this lack of form, when difference becomes a part, is maintained as a part of the determination, this lack of form Deleuze calls stupidity. So here, if thought is pure determination, the thinking subject, the corresponding indeterminate, or the groundlessness, is the opposite of that, which is stupidity. That's what Deleuze calls it anyway. Which kind of makes sense. It's a funny word to use to describe it, and you do have to think kind of outside the way we normally use the word, but maybe a better way to have put it would be to say, if thought is pure determination, the corresponding indeterminate would be the absence of thought, or the unconscious, right? I mean, I think we have talked about it like that before, but stupidity is a little bit more hard-hitting, maybe. It gives it a bit more punch. But yeah, that's what he means by stupidity anyway, the groundlessness that that thought is based on, the origin of thought. If we're going to, again, I've said this before with regard to the unconscious, if we're going to understand thought, understand the origin of thought, we have to go to something that isn't thought. And Deleuze is just calling this groundless root stupidity here to contrast it with thought as pure determination. And this was where he said thought only thinks when it's forced to do so. And that was quite a nice idea. You have to be almost, but not quite, coerced or dragged into thinking. You have to be pulled out of your original state of stupidity, our original state of stupidity. Because that which forces thought to think is that stupidity. It's that attempt to go beyond that, beyond stupidity, into thought. So again, that's a nice, maybe it sounds nice to think of it in those terms, moving beyond stupidity. Stupidity, you want to go past it, and to do that, we're moving into thought as pure determination, but there's value to this prior state of the indeterminate, or stupidity, or perhaps better, the unconscious. So representation that has become infinite, the way we looked at it in grounding, acquires a presentiment of groundlessness, Deleuze says. But the problem is that for representation, every individuality must be a personal I, and every singularity must be an individual self. That's how representation works. That's how this model grasps reality, grasps the determination of the indeterminate, how it understands the fact that there can be something rather than nothing. So every individuality must be personal, every singularity individual. Without an I, there's no individuality. And without without individuation, there's no singularity. So you must have those for this model of representation to work. But groundlessness lacks both individuality and singularity. So the only solution for representation here, the only way that representation can understand groundlessness, is as a completely undifferentiated abyss. An abyss that lacks any difference. Because if there's no I and there's no self, and that's what groundlessness is. Groundlessness lacks individuality and singularity, which means for representation it lacks an I and a self. And if it lacks an I and a self for representation, then there's nothing differentiating any of that. It's all the same thing. There's no difference. The elimination of difference. And that's what you end up with models that try to understand reality through representation. You end up with this completely undifferentiated abyss. You end up with a oneness or a wholeness, something that has no parts, there's no difference within it. And Deleuze mentions by name Schelling and Schopenhauer. That's what you end up with this kind of picture. When you try and understand reality through representation, you end up with this diffuse wholeness or oneness, like with a capital O, that has no difference within it, in which none of the parts are differentiated, because there are no parts to this thing. But that's the picture of groundlessness that representation gives you. For Deleuze, however, he doesn't have those same problems, because he takes on board this notion of the passive self and the fractured I. The self in the form of passive self is only an event which takes place in pre-existing fields of individuation. It contemplates and contracts the individuating factors of such fields and constitutes itself at the points of resonance of their series. Similarly, the I in the form of a fractured I allows to pass all the ideas defined by their singularities, themselves prior to fields of individuation. Just as singularity as differential determination is pre-individual, so is individuation as individuating difference an anti-I or anti-self. The world of one or they is a world of impersonal individuations and pre-individual singularities. So just that idea that there is still individuation and there are still singularities in the groundlessness. So even though there's no ground, there is still individuation and there are still singularities, but they're just not I and self. They're not the way that representation understands those things. Instead, there's individuation in the impersonal fields of individuation. We've talked about those, and we'll cover them in the next video, I think. That is to say, there's a passive self here, or as Deleuze says, an anti-I or an anti-self. And there are still singularities, but these are just pre-individual singularities. And this is the fractured I. It's that these are the we talked about this with regards to intensity within ideas as that which allow the ideas to actualize, to incarnate, to become determined as from out of the indeterminate state in which they were impersonal and pre-individual, but impersonal as a passive self and pre-individual as a fractured I. So still difference within the groundlessness. That's kind of the picture here. So the external illusion of representation, which is the result of all of its internal illusions, is that groundlessness lacks difference, when in fact it swarms with difference, Deleuze says. And that's quite a nice little way to finish that section, I think. So let's move into the third part, which is simulacra. So we'll start this section off with a quote, I think. Systems in which different relates to different through difference itself are systems of simulacra. Such systems are intensive. They rest ultimately upon the nature of intensive quantities, which precisely communicate through their differences. So all difference, no trace of representation here, no common sense or good sense, no identity or sameness, no resemblance, no analogy, no opposition, no negation. Systems, I like that, systems in which different relates to different through difference itself. And another important part of that quote is the importance of intensity. Intensity is what provides the catalyst, if you like. It's what the fact that there are these differences of intensity within simulacra, within these systems, are what allow for movement, for change, for anything to happen. So there has to be that in order for any idea or concept, in a metaphysical sense of those words, to be actualized. And he gives us, what are there, seven aspects to simulacra, which I'll just go through fairly briefly because we've covered them all throughout the book. But this is, like I say, just a nice summary of what simulacra are. The first point he makes is simulacra have depth, or that spatium in which intensities are organized. So this was space as intensive quantity, i.e. in the system or in the idea, not space as extension. Depth, spatium, that's the, and one way to think about maybe internal distance, internal extension. But it's what allows there, again, this is all about how there can be, how anything can happen, how any idea can actualize, requires this inner depth, space as intensive quantity. The second part of simulacra are the disparate series that these intensities form and the fields of individuation that they outline, or what Deleuze calls the individuating factors. So that's just another required aspect to simulacra. Third is the dark precursor, which we discussed this way back at the beginning of the book. And the dark precursor is that which allows these different series within the idea to communicate with each other, which allows there to be interaction or interplay between the different series of the idea. We called this difference in the second degree, and back at the beginning of the book again, we also called it a virtual object, the dark precursor. It's a virtual object because it it is what allows there to be communication between these different series, but it itself must not be visible. It must remain invisible in order to be that which allows these series to communicate. And Deleuze called this the object equals X. So that's the dark precursor, just another part of Simulacra. The fourth part of Simulacra are the linkages, internal resonances, and forced movements which result. So the linkages were in habitus, the first synthesis. The internal resonances we talked about as being a part of eros, which is our capacity for grasping virtual objects from the past, and this was connected with the second synthesis. And then the forced movement came in the death instinct, which was in the third synthesis. And this one always exceeded the resonating series themselves. And it exceeds the resonating series in the sense that it's different from them. So difference is again built into this picture at every level. Even when you have the linkages and the internal resonances result in this forced movement. It's not a movement which is simply the sum of all of its parts, the sum of the linkages and the internal resonances. It generates something which is different from those. Generates something genuinely new. So difference, like I say, it's just embedded in this whole picture at the deepest level for Deleuze. The fifth aspect of Simulacra is the constitution of passive selves and larval subjects in the system and the formation of pure spatio-temporal dynamisms. So just describing the process, the intensity in the ideas which will eventually lead to individuation. Then the sixth part, the qualities and extensions, or the species and the parts, which form the double differentiation with a C of the system and cover over the preceding factors. So remember, we talked about actualization in quality or species, and actualization in number and part. And those were two different dimensions to the actualization. One being quality and the other being extension. And importantly, differentiation covers over the original differences. So that's what it is to differentiate, is to cover over the origin, cover over the root. And that's why it appears as if difference is not at the core, but that's because in order for the actualization to take place, the difference must be covered over. If it's not covered over, then you don't have the proper actualization. Actualization is kind of a blurring of the process which drives it. And the seventh part of what Deleuze says compose Simulacra are the centers of envelopment, which nevertheless testify to the persistence of these factors in the developed world of qualities and extensities. So the centers of envelopment, again, within the idea, as the idea is being actualized, that's the core, that's the root, the origin. Distance within the idea is enveloped by intensity, and this is where the dark precursor comes in order to be developed in qualities and extensities, to be actualized when it's actualized. So the difference there, and I think I remember saying this when we came up to, when we saw it in, I think it was chapter 5, the way to understand envelop is as kind of an opposite, appearing with develop. Develop is the process of actualization in qualities and extensities, and envelop is that which gathers things together, gathers these internal resonances, gathers the fields of individuation, puts the distances, overcomes the distances within the idea in order to spark that development. So I've got one last quote for you. Systems of simulacra affirm divergence and decentering. The only unity, the only convergence of all the series is an informal chaos in which they are all included. No series enjoys a privilege over others. None possesses the identity of a model, none the resemblance of a copy. None is either opposed or analogous to another. Each is constituted by differences and communicates with the others through differences of differences. Nice. No unity. It's all chaos. It's all difference. No representation. There's no model, identity. There's no copy, resemblance. No series is opposed to or analogous to another. And yeah, it's difference right down to the core. These systems, simulacra, are the sites for the actualization of ideas. And that's what we're going to look at in the next video. So let's have a look at a summary. First up, we looked at representation. And this is the model that philosophy has used to try to eliminate or subordinate difference, to grasp reality. The four roots of this of representation, or the principle of reason: identity, opposition, analogy, and resemblance. We looked at some of the past philosophers that Deleuze covered. We talked about Leibniz and his infinitely small, his analysis, his attempt to conquer the infinite through delving down, through analyzing into infinitesimals. We looked at Hegel and his attempt to do the same thing, to overcome difference in the infinitely large through synthesis. And we also looked at Plato and his model, copy, simulacra philosophy, or philosophy based on those ideas. Then we talked about thought, and with regard to representation, the idea with when thought is represented like this, the image of thought is that difference is eliminated. It's covered over by an image. And we talked about the 7 postulates in the book, but here we just briefly look at common sense and good sense, 2 of those. Because they're foundational, really. So difference is, when difference is represented in thought, we get an identical subject. And difference then is cancelled through quality, and inequality equalized in extension. So both of those ways of representing how thought works end up eliminating difference and equalizing inequality. Then we looked at repetition in relation to representation, and repetition, when it's represented, becomes material and bare. The second part of the video was grounding and groundlessness. So with grounding, the goal here is to determine, but to determine in representation, to determine something according to that model. And there were 3 senses of grounding that Deleuze covered: essence, representation, and pure past. And the pure past unites the other 2, the first 2, yielding a present which actually passes, because the ground is that pure past, the past as a background, which allows the representation as a representation of the essence to arise as a present. Then the other part of this was groundlessness or depth, and this is an attempt to capture the ambiguity that is essential to determination. A way to determine without relying on the categories of representation. And so first we looked at ideas as multiplicities which are irreducible to the same. In here, the ground itself rises to the surface. So that's why this is groundlessness. The ground itself comes to the surface as covered over, as something that doesn't feature, but it's nevertheless an integral part of what is being determined. So it rises to the surface, but in not featuring, it lacks form. And this Deleuze called stupidity. And it's this which forced us to think, which forces thought to arise, to come about. And this was based on a threefold principle: determinability, reciprocal determination, and complete determination. We didn't talk about that much in this video. We will look at that, I think, in the next video a bit more. In representation, when representation tries to think groundlessness, we end up with a completely undifferentiated abyss. That is to say, we end up with something that lacks any kind of difference. We end up with a whole or a totality that has gone by many different names in philosophy: absolute wholeness, absolute idea, will, all with capital letters at the front. And these all are attempts to grasp the groundlessness of determination, indetermination, but to grasp it through representation. For the transcendental picture of groundlessness, however, it overcomes this problem because it allows for impersonal individuations and pre-individual singularities. So instead of being limited by this notion of a thinking subject having to have an I and a self, having to start with an I and a self, Deleuze can make use of these notions of his, of the passive self and the fractured I. Even though there is no personal self or personal I, there is nevertheless difference within the groundlessness in the sense of these impersonal individuations and pre-individual singularities. And finally, we looked at simulacra, and these are basically intensive systems in which different relates to different through difference in itself. And these are the sites for the actualization of ideas, which is what we're going to look at in the next video. Okay, nice. So that's the first of what I'm sure will only be 3 videos for the conclusion, but kind of just a nice recap of all of the ideas that we've covered in the book, and maybe a little bit of clarification regarding certain things. I feel like we're just getting a decent kind of big picture look at Deleuze's philosophy. Okay, so thanks for watching. Hopefully it helped, and I'll see you in the next video.